that the question be now put.
I will take
Mr. Chair.
Catherine Delahunty.
Yeah, I'm pleased to rise to take a call on what some of us are calling the Ken Ring budget, Part 2, because it's based on some fairly interesting random predictions of the future economy, and I think they may even need advice from Ken Ring, because he makes a lot of mistakes, but at least he's a colourful character. What I'd like to say about Part 2, this morning some of us attended the Child Poverty Action Breakfast, and the Child Poverty Action Breakfast identified the issues that we're discussing in Part 2, KiwiSaver and working for families, as worthy of key analysis in terms of who's ignored. And there's been a consistent ability to ignore two crucial parts of our community, and Part 2 continues that trend. And one is beneficiaries. Beneficiaries are only recognised in this budget as non-people, non-workers, and their children who don't receive working for families now. We have had increasing poverty, as Child Poverty Action pointed out this morning, for those families for more than 2 decades, starting with Roger Douglas and the mother of all budgets. That's when it started. And we don't see that Part 2 does anything for those people. And so I heard the government say last week that they were a government for the vulnerable, and I think their definition of the vulnerable is the 13% of people who've got richer, but that's not my idea of the vulnerable. The vulnerable are people who are having trouble surviving right now. So there was good discussion at the Child Poverty Action Breakfast about the vulnerable and about Part 2. Because we are very concerned that despite trying to pitch this as not a serious attack on KiwiSaver, I have already in the last 24 hours met people who are saying, I think I'll pull out. And these are people who never ever saved before, because they actually find that $500 is not enough. That actually the government $1,000 a year was an incredible incentive to save. But in hard times, they may as well now keep the money, because they're struggling so hard with the basic costs that without that government incentive, it's just not worth it to them anymore. And I think that is tragic. But it tells you how many people are living in that space, with the difference between 500 and 1,000 in terms of government contribution is critical to them. And now they're going to give up saving for their future. And I think that's because they're forced into survival mode in a time when costs are increasing by Part 2. So it is a shame about KiwiSaver, which has been one of the most breakthrough initiatives in this country for getting ordinary people who don't have the capacity to join fancy schemes and don't have reliable employment and don't have a lot of money, and some of them even on benefits, to start saving so that they can have some self-sufficiency in old age. So that is a really sad thing to hear, and it's an indictment, because we actually did believe the government's promise that they would not cut KiwiSaver. And I do agree with the previous speaker that that will be interesting during the election. That will be debated hotly, and people are not stupid, and they will go out there and do the maths and look at whether they're better off going into a scheme like KiwiSaver anymore. I think one media person called it paying more to stay the same. And that's a really sad thing, because people who struggle to pay all their bills cannot afford to pay more to stay the same in terms of savings. They cannot afford to do that. And we are so buffered in this House. We are so privileged by our own super schemes, our own protective devices to make sure that we have a pleasant retirement, and that we forget at our peril the really vulnerable people. And the budget is supposed to be about them, not us. The already insulated and protected, well-off people sitting in this chamber. I'd like to return to Part 2 in terms of working for families. Now, reducing the abatement threshold down to 35Ks means that abatement applies to a 2-parent family with one partner working full-time at the minimum wage and the other working 12 hours a week at the minimum wage. And raising the abatement rate to 25 cents in the dollar results in an effective marginal tax rate of 58%. And losing almost 3/5 of any extra income in tax and in working for families abatement is far from an incentive for parents who are earning just around 35K or over to quote the government, work harder to better themselves, which is what the government says they should be doing. So we are very disappointed that working for families is being undermined at that level for those people who are in that marginal area and who really needed working families to stay the same. I think it was Child Poverty Action who said this morning they don't have a problem with the richest people losing working for families because it was never intended for them anyway. So it's actually quite appropriate that government should cut back on their access to this. But it's not appropriate to cut that down to the people around 35k. It is not an appropriate thing to have done. We think Part 2 is carefully calculated to strip away, Mr Chair.
Amy Adams.
The question be now put.